Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on planning for the future. We're very excited to see over 125 registrants for today's material. We're going to give people just a few minutes to continue logging on before we start, but before we jump into the material, I thought I'd do some housekeeping. My name is Jay Perlman. I'm your speaker for today. And some quick background about me. I've been in the facilities industry for 20 years, and I've been at Sightlines from the start. I've worked at hundreds of institutions, and I'm often a speaker at events hosted by Nakubo, APA, and other organizations. Quick agenda for today. We're going to just do a few slides to tell those of you who are not familiar with us a little bit more about what we do. We're going to jump into talking about some of the challenges that you all might be facing regarding planning for the future, ultimately lead to some strategies to effectively plan, and then open it up for questions and answers. We want this to be as interactive as possible, so throughout, please feel free to raise your hand or simply type a question into the box. I'm going to try to stop along the way to answer as much as I can. Also have an opportunity and some time at the end to go over those that I missed. In addition, if you feel like you've missed anything, or if you feel like you might want to view the slides over again, we'll be mailing out today's slides to each of the attendees almost immediately following today's broadcast. So a little bit about the company. The way that I always like to describe us is sort of the investment advisor for educational facilities. You know, we're working with hundreds of institutions every year to try to help them find ways that they can use their capital more effectively, and ultimately also identify opportunities to be more effective operationally so that they can reduce overhead. We've been honored to work with hundreds of institutions across the country every year. We work with approximately 450 colleges and universities in 43 states and Canada, and this gives us perspective on industry trends and best practices across schools today. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Also wanted to mention that Sightlines is a Gordian company, and Gordian provides data, software, and expertise for all phases of the building lifecycle. The material that we're going to go through today is actually based upon an article by the same name that's currently on our website. After this, if you'd like to have a greater in-depth read, please feel free to download that. It is available for free. The excerpts that I'm going to be talking about today center on the capital planning components of the article. But before we jump into some of our recommendations and findings, I always like to start with talking about how we got here. You know, why are we facing the challenges that we all are today? And I always like to start with a quote. And the quote that I want to talk today is from an article that's called "Before the Roof Caves In." A lot of us have been in campuses and actually across the industry. We've been experiencing a fairly large growth in the footprint of institutions. New buildings, new programs, attempts to grow enrollment have all expanded the sizes of our schools. What this quote says is, one side effect of this rapid growth has been the creation of an increasingly large obligation for the future renewal and replacement of physical plant. And that sounds accurate. I mean, every time I present this and I ask an audience to raise their hand if this rings true, I get a lot of agreement. What I find most interesting is that this particular quote is not new. It's not from last week or last month or even last year. This quote is nearly 40 years old. It was actually written in 1980 by a gentleman named Rick Biedenwig. And Rick was essentially saying, you know, guys, we need to be careful because we've expanded our campuses so much that we're hurting our ability to keep up with needs. So what we tried to do, and this is one of my favorite graphs, and goes along the mantra of sometimes the most important statistics are the simplest. We plotted all of the construction ages of all of our facilities across our hundreds of institutional members on one chart. And what we found is that accurately, when Rick wrote his article in 1980, we were nearing an end of the post-war construction boom. Almost 45% of campus space was built during this period from 1951 through 1975. And what we see is some older buildings, buildings that are older today, but ones that were typically built quickly and were not of the highest quality oftentimes. We needed space and we needed it fast. We had an expansion within higher ed. We had the baby boom generation. We had the space race. We had a large investment from the federal government in technical education. And so we built classrooms, we built laboratories, we built residence halls, and we built them fast. And a lot of people out there are probably pretty familiar with these. There are a lot of brick, aluminum casement, flat roof buildings out there that are ones that we're trying to figure out what to do with today. So when Rick wrote his article, he was basically saying, you know, we've just grown so much that now we should probably take a pause and think about how we're going to take care of these spaces. And actually, what the numbers show is that there was that lull in construction. However, if we build this out a little bit, there is another boom in what we call the complex era. And that's in the late 90s, early 2000s, where we began to build a lot more new space. Good news is generally higher quality, but they are technically complex and are expensive to maintain and repair. The interesting thing is where we are today, and this is what's most important, is if you look at that lull in construction when Rick wrote his article, that first peak, that post-war peak, was nearing its first renewal cycle. 20, 25 years of age, we see the need for renewing of interior finishes, replacement of little smaller components, pumps, motors, and repairs across the board. Today, where we are, is those complex 1990s, early 2000s spaces are reaching the same point in their life, while at the same time, those post-war buildings are reaching 50 years of age, which is a major replacement cycle for many larger building components. We're talking boilers, chillers, roofs, exterior updates. All have to be done. So what we have today is an interesting period. We have the catch-up needs of those post-war buildings competing with the keep-up needs of the newer complex spaces. And so we think there are simply more needs, there's more space, but the interesting thing is that these compounding life cycles are driving up needs across institutions across the country. What it also means is that for the foreseeable future is that we are in an environment where there is going to be more needs than funding. We can't pull the same levers that we pulled in the 80s. A lot of schools can't borrow more money. Raising tuition is problematic since we've raised tuition every year for the past 25 years consistently. It's harder to go to the state for aid, and gifts and grants aren't where they once were. So there is going to be more need than there is money. So the question isn't necessarily what is there to be done. The question is often determining priorities and figuring out a process so that you're optimizing the money that you do spend. Having done this at hundreds of institutions, there is something that our experience does tell us, and it's one of our most important concepts here, is that capital planning is more than just a project list. And what do we mean by that? Yes, it is absolutely important to compile a list of needs. It is very important to know what's out there today and what's going to be out there in the future as our components cross life cycles and thresholds. But it's not just about knowing what that list is. It's about figuring out what to do with it. It's about creating a plan that you can execute. So we hear this a lot from institutions. Is it time to complete a facilities assessment? And sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes that school is at a pretty important threshold, and it's important that we begin to catalog needs. But it's not the only question. In my mind, the question is, once we have that list of needs, what do we do with it? And that is that traditionally, we have compiled a list of needs with some form of a technical study, whatever that might be, and then we've gone directly from that to picking the projects that we want to do in a very, very bottom-up way. And because there is simply not enough funding, and there's arguably comparably less than there's been in the past, that methodology actually falls short in a lot of important ways. Number one, it's very important, and we often don't harness sufficient operating knowledge in the process. We don't tie to mission of the institution, which is key and probably the most important thing here. Third, we don't integrate financial capacity. And because of that, we truly miss opportunities to make sure that we're spending money in the right way. So the goal at the end of the day isn't only to know what's broken. The goal is answering the question, how can I make that backlog actionable? How can I walk away not only understanding what conditions are my facilities, but walking away with a plan that I can communicate effectively to decision makers at the institution and walk away with a game plan and funding. And essentially, one of the things that we see out there is that old method of trying to compel action through communicating a daunting deferred maintenance or deferred renewal figure does not work. And too often what it does, instead of compelling action, it freezes decision making and actually further compounds the core issue. So a lot of what we think planning for the future involves is, number one, making sure that we have a way to stop the bleeding. I'll talk about what that means on the very next slide. Number two is to make the problem smaller. That doesn't mean ignore issues. What it means is find a way to break a seemingly insurmountable problem into smaller, more digestible pieces. And one way that we think that that's done very effectively is by what are called building portfolios. And we're going to talk about that as well. Third, sustain the impact of finite funding. And that is really looking multiple years, looking into the future. Really helpful for operators, for planners, for architects, if we can think in 5-year chunks, sometimes even more. It's very difficult to execute a comprehensive plan when we're only looking 1 year out. And then finally, use that to mitigate risk. Again, in that environment where there is going to be more need than there is funding, risk management is crucial, and that is find a way to prioritize those things that affect facility safety and critical preservation issues. So how do we start that conversation on campus? Even before we quantify needs, I said we need to stop the bleeding. What does that mean? It means that project backlogs just don't appear. Project backlogs grow over time, and they grow because we don't have the ability to appropriately fund keep up needs. It doesn't mean that somebody didn't do their job correctly. What it means is that we have compounding life cycles in our buildings, and the institution simply does not have the ability to keep up with all those as they become due. So what's important before you engage in any capital improvement program is to make sure that you're not just kicking the can down the road. You can fix a building, but you should also work on fixing the lack of funding that got us there in the first place. Because if you don't find a way to improve expenditure quality, spend more on your annual stewardship, increase planned maintenance, increase preventative maintenance, we run the risk of having that backlog grow back. And it's why I say grow back, because one of my favorite lines here is the beauty of low-hanging fruit is that it oftentimes grows back. We can fix a project, but we also have to fix the rate of deferral. And that's a conversation that should begin with leadership early. I can't tell you how many times we've heard in trustee meetings or at other groups when a facilities department is requesting funding, something along the lines of, I thought we fixed that deferred maintenance problem years ago. We need to instill a conversation where that's a recurring process, where that is a conversation that we are engaged in on an annual basis. And that should be done before any sort of capital planning exercise begins. The other thing is acknowledge that we need to separate two things, and that is the technical from the strategic. And that's what we call bottom-up versus top-down. And that is to get to a multi-year capital and investment plan, you do need that technical side. You do have to understand what are my needs, where are they, what are my worst buildings, what are my best buildings, and what's the time frame of needs on each of these specific line items. However, that's not the only thing that you have to do. At the same time, you have to worry about the strategic. How do we tie that to mission? How do we tie that to funding? And ultimately, you want to engage leadership in a process that focuses on the strategic so that you can do your job and focus on the technical. So how do we do that? We call it tying the inventory to operations and mission. We see successful schools dedicated to inclusion. And what that means is that regardless of who does your facilities assessment, regardless of who inspects your spaces or is working with you on planning, it's important that you engage different people at the institution. The first group is facilities trades, and that is get them involved in the process. Use them to review your list. These are the people who know where to hit the boiler on Saturday night when it stops working. So these are the people that you want in the room reviewing the long-term needs of your facilities. Not only might you find new things that you might have to add, but you might find projects that are just inappropriate. You might find projects that you don't have to do, that an engineer who's far into the facility might recommend, but ultimately it's not in line with how you operate the building. So we have to get their knowledge into the process. The other reason why that's really important is that ultimately these are the people that have to execute on that plan. And the first mistake they find by a plan that they didn't develop and they didn't offer comment on invalidates the entire study. And you don't want that to happen. The second thing is to reach out and go beyond where a lot of capital planners often go. and that is to meet with different university staff, identify programmatic needs, identify funding. We need to try to tie our maintenance list to the strategy of the institution. What's the long-term strategic plan? What departments are growing? What areas are growing? Do we aspire to become a more residential institution? Are we adding more technology offerings? What does that plan look like? If you're investing capital, your upkeep plan has to match or has to at least reconcile with what the long-term institutional plan is. So those two different types of meetings are very important. The other thing that's really important is to get a sense of what kind of funding could be available. And the way that I always explain it is, if you have a $100 million need and a $3 million capital spend every year, well, $100 million capital plan is really not that helpful for you. What you want to know is what's the most important $3 million, and then you're going to argue really hard to make it 5 or 6 or even 10 million. But you have to understand the financial framework that you're operating in to be accepted at that planning table seriously. So we've started a conversation that's technical. We've enhanced it here with a conversation that ties to mission and finance. How do we embody that? And we talked about this before, and we see schools doing this over and over again, and that is building portfolios. Break that campus down into smaller chunks that tie to the way that the school thinks about itself, its long-term strategy, or objectives going forward. And the whole idea is that not all buildings are created equal. And by developing a portfolio approach, we can focus investment and we can prioritize those portfolios that are more important to the long-term viability and plans at that institution. How do we do this? Well, it really goes back to those interviews that we do with stakeholders at the institution. How do they think about the campus? How are they planning about the campus? When they have planning conversations with the board, how are they organizing their thoughts? It could be by age, condition, building location, institutional focus, academic requirements, student needs. Any sort of driver could play into a portfolio. I'm going to give you an example here before I go into more detailed examples. We worked with an institution years ago that had just passed a strategic plan, and a core component of that strategic plan was the need to increase student retention, particularly freshman retention. So what they did is actually develop a portfolio called the Freshman Experience. And they were able to fill that portfolio with buildings that freshmen interacted with on a regular basis. Freshman residence halls, the intramural hall, dining hall, large lecture facilities, spaces that freshmen were in and out of a lot. And they were able to target specific investments and set targets for that portfolio that were separate and distinct from other portfolios at the school. And it worked. They increased retention for 2 years in a row following that. You can do that with almost anything at an institution, and there's no reason why you only have to have one scheme. You can break it down any number of ways. And then finally, who? And this has to be a comprehensive discussion that goes across institutional and department leaders, so that not only can they agree, but then they can communicate that to their departments and their constituents within the institution. So let's look at some different portfolio arrangements. The first one is relatively simple. It's functional portfolios. This institution truly thought about themselves in terms of the different uses of space on campus, but we did something a little unique for them, which I thought was actually pretty important. They had a fairly substantial amount of need on campus. It's not a large institution, but if you look at that middle row there, they segmented their backlog between grounds and infrastructure, building needs, and then transitional buildings. What does that mean? Buildings that they don't know if they're going to have in 5 or 10 years. And we're seeing more and more of those conversations on campus because of just the issues I talked about before, those post-war facilities, which people don't know if they want around for a long time. So basically what we said is we're going to put transitional spaces off to the side, and for the time being, we're going to keep them running. We're going to keep them safe. And then we were able to segment that backlog amongst core academic, student life, residence halls, historic facilities, which were very important to keep them independent for them, and then ultimately the perimeter spaces across the campus, which we all have some degree of. Very effective in communicating need, breaking down a large problem into smaller, digestible chunks, removing the worry of those transitional spaces from the conversation, and enhancing the way that they think about their campus regularly. Example number 2, here's a school that did something interesting. We started out the same way. We looked at total needs and then broke it down amongst grounds and infrastructure and building needs. Little different in that they had a very extensive parking inventory, which wasn't going to be handled in the same way. But what they did was think about their facilities in terms of longevity. So a lot like the concept of transitional in the one that you saw before, they went further with it. They said, you know what? There are spaces that are going to be transitional that we might not have in 5 to 10 years. On the other hand, there's the Millennium Standard, which are new buildings that the institution wants to keep at a different standard because they are new and they want to avoid deferral in those. So they're going to fund those differently than transitional spaces. There are also legacy spaces, which had significant backlog issues, but were part of the fabric of the institution, so they were interested in maintaining them. And then rentals, which were handled aside on an income basis. The next one is interesting because it begins to get into funding. And what they said is, the portfolio concept is really interesting, but we need to use it as a way to figure out how we're going to raise money to accomplish these projects. So they did something very interesting. They broke out the needs of all these buildings, but then within the third level down, science, research, athletic, residence hall, faculty, staff, and housing, fraternities, and transitional, they segmented those because the way that they're going to raise money for those projects is different. They're looking for grant money for the research space. They're looking for donor money for sports and residential facilities. And they're looking to change the way that they operate in the faculty housing area, which is potentially removing those spaces from their ownership. And then off to the left side, they said there are academic and administrative spaces that don't fit into that. And those are the spaces that we're going to concentrate our institutional general fund capital dollars on. And then there's my favorite, which is a very interesting way of looking at it, which was creating a very simple quadrant chart that pins building conditions against value of that building to the institution. Value is somewhat subjective, totally understand that, but the institution went through a fairly rigorous exercise independent of us to determine how important that building is to the fabric of the school. And what we said is we're going to work with you to put every building into one of 4 buckets, starting up in the blue. Spaces that are in good condition, but are not particularly valuable to the program. And those are buildings that in general we'd repair, but would look for ways to repurpose going forward. On the red side, on the bottom, high value to program, but bad condition. Those are spaces where we would target repairs and improvements and retain the building. If you look at the green, high value to program, good condition. This is all about recurring annual stewardship to make sure that we don't defer and we don't slip into lower and lower conditions. And the big one, the gray one, low value and low NAV, those are facilities that would be slated for renovation or removal from the institution. For the time being, we'd focus only on emergency work and things that were related to life safety. There are 1,000 different ways that you can divide your campus. I've shown you 4, but ultimately each one is successful in taking a seemingly insurmountable problem, putting it within the lens of priorities of the institution, so you can begin to target and optimize the money that you do have. So that's a very strategic level. And we always think that it is important to have a strategic discussion rather than a purely technical discussion. Now, there is always going to be a need, or there may be a need, to get a little bit more technical. And that's why the way that you segment and the way that you categorize your projects is very important. And we always recommend that when you categorize and you present line item information, if you have to a board, is to look at it in 3 different ways. What is it? Is it a repair? Is it modernization? Or is it infrastructure? How does it impact the institution? Is it reliability? Is it asset preserving? Does it enhance a program of the institution? Does it help me save money? Or is it related to life safety? And when do we have to do it? 1 to 3 years, 4 to 7 years, whatever time horizon you think is appropriate for your analysis. And operating within portfolios and having breakdowns like this let you do something that you couldn't do otherwise, which is begin to plan from the top down. And you can create different investment objectives for different portfolios at the institution. And this is one example of how we might represent this, but here's an example from a school where every color dot represents a different portfolio at that institution. And you can set targets. And we use NAV as the metric for that, which is essentially the inverse of the FCI. 100 is a perfect building. A 0 is complete deferral. But you get to decide, what's my goal? Do I want my academic spaces or whatever portfolio to fall within the green, within the yellow, within the red? Where do I want each one within 5 years? Do I want to maintain where they are? Do I want to improve them? You know, my transitional spaces can be unique from my millennial standards, making sure that from the top down, I'm defining an outcome, and then I'm defining the dollars that are going to go into that portfolio. Once you have that defined, and you understand what your plan is, now you can begin to plan dollar investment within each portfolio. And only after you've done that do you begin to pick the projects that make sense. Ultimately, what you want to avoid is having a conversation at the senior leadership level about which roof is more important and why. That's your job. Let's try to be as strategic as possible when we're developing long-term, multiple-year capital plans. Another way to look at that, and we talked about this earlier, currently a lot of institutions develop this full project inventory, and then from the bottom up, pick projects. Well, there's a different way, and that is largely what we just talked about, which is look at that full inventory from a strategic lens, from a portfolio basis, insert time frame, whittle that list down based upon investment criteria and investment outcomes, and at that point, the decisions that you have to make are actually fewer and fewer. Some other things to keep in mind about communicating that plan. I don't want to spend that much time on it, but things that we see, don'ts and do's, or do's and don'ts. Don't provide an overwhelming list of needs without a framework. We just talked about a framework. Do make sure that you're aiming the conversation in a strategic level so it's framed and targeted. Try not to get caught up in specific technical details. You want to have those available, but you want to focus on outcomes as much as you possibly can. You don't want to turn over your list of needs to somebody else above you and say, we're done. Stay involved. Work with stakeholders throughout the institution so you're helping to drive consensus and constituency at the school. And finally, you always want to avoid ultimatums. Prioritization is a continual process at an institution. We want to make sure that we're part of that rather than the roadblock to that. So to quickly conclude, we want to articulate the cause of deferral and have a conversation about that. We want to communicate that credible inventory of needs, and we want to do that in the context of a strategic process. We're not just picking line items, we're developing a framework where we can prioritize and align with mission of the institution. And something else that is really important is measure performance and measure the effectiveness of your plan. You're never going to get enough the first time, and there are always emergencies. So throughout any capital plan, you want to be able to show your success, show how effective of a steward you are with the institution's money, so that when you're back at that table again next year or the year after, you're talking about results and you're talking about real change at the institution. And then finally, you want to update that plan as you have to. We've talked through this, but again, define those needs, properly code those needs, think about strategy, pick the projects, execute, and be able to show success at the institution. I'm going to stop there. I am going to direct you back to the full article online. There are quite a few other chapters to it. Most notably, there's a lot on some of the challenges regarding recruiting and maintaining the modern workforce. And also there's some material on increasing flexibility in long-term planning. So I would encourage you, if those are of interest to you, to download that from our website. I am going to open it up to questions now, and what I do want to remind people is that when you close out of this webinar, you are going to be asked about 3 or 4 questions to rate this material. It's important to us that we're able to not only understand how we did, but how we can offer you more important content in the future. So please let us know how we did. And I am going to turn it over to questions. And I do have one question. My campus is small. Do any of the recommendations that you have changed with respect to a small institution? I'm going to say no and yes, and that is the concepts or some of the things that I talked about here do absolutely still apply, but you essentially need to take it down a level. And I've seen schools, for example, instead of doing portfolios by building, I've seen them do portfolios by wing or by floors or by department, so that they're able to break that campus still down into digestible chunks, but in a way that that still enables decision making in a more effective manner. And I'm going to hang on for a couple of extra questions if anybody has any, but if not, thank you for your time this afternoon, and I hope to have you on future webinars from Sightlines.